Welcome to today's webinar, which is an FD's role in executing an exit strategy. My name is Phil Scott, Director at FD Recruit, and I'm joined by two expert panelists who are going to share their knowledge of completing several exit processes. The running order for today, we're going to have a main set of questions that I'm going to go through with the panelists, and then towards the end will be the Q&A, which is the listeners' chance to put their questions to the panelists. If you do want to do that, if you use the chat box facility, which is located at the bottom of your screen. So I'd like to introduce the two panelists. So first up, I'll introduce Steve Hollinshead. If you'd like to give the listeners a quick 60-second overview, Steve, of your background and your exits, and also how your knowledge is now compared to when you first went through an exit.
Thanks very much, Phil, and good afternoon to everyone. So the first part of my career was spent with Coopers and Lybrand, where I trained and qualified after finishing university. And during that time, I was involved in several exit processes, including the government's privatisation of British Steel and the NASDAQ IPO of a young biotech company in New Jersey. After leaving what had now become PwC, I joined a no longer core division of Ocean Group PLC as the FD, and we sold that division via a controlled auction process to a private equity owned Dutch acquirer, and I moved to Holland as the CFO of the enlarged group to begin an IPO process aimed at Singapore. This quickly evolved into a dual track endeavour that culminated in a two-horse race between the Port of Singapore Authority and AP Moller Maersk, which in due course the latter was the winner. And then I spent the next 12 months in Copenhagen working on the delivery of the post-acquisition integration plan. Later in my career, I joined a multinational utility company as CFO with a brief to prepare it for a New York Stock Exchange IPO, which we then completed after 2 years of very concentrated effort. And finally, as Group FD of a global construction business, I was at the centre of a divestment and debt reduction programme designed to ensure that the residual group was in the best place to prosper during the next phase of its evolution. So in summary, transactions and in particular exits have played a large part in my professional life to date, and I now enjoy helping entrepreneurs on a part-time basis with projects they don't currently have the resources and or experience to tackle in-house. So in answer to your question, Phil, I've gained a lot of experience, much of it the hard way, on a whole variety of different routes to exit.
Thanks, Steve. And Ian, do you want to just give the viewers a quick overview of your background and exits and what you now know?
I'm not very lucky. I've managed to look at exits from many different angles. So like Steve, I started off in the profession with, again, showing my age, with PW before the C was added. So I did a lot of work on the due diligence, transactional due diligence for exits. I then worked in corporate finance for many years and was therefore advising on exits as an advisor. And it's amazing how you pick up business just through doing exits. So we got called in to look after a ladies' underwear manufacturer for M&S that had suffered a major fraud that effectively undermined the financial integrity of the entire company. And in working to sort that out and selling it, we actually then got appointed by a family business who made all of M&S's lycra leggings to sell that. So actually by selling one thing, you get business in another. I then moved on and worked in private equity for 6 years as an investor with what was then the in-house PE arm of the Prudential, which is now Silverfleet Capital. And obviously worked on entries and exits. And subsequently I've done, I guess, 2 rounds of being CFO of private equity backed businesses. and I've exited 2 of those. One was initially a family-controlled company, specialist label manufacturer, which we exited by way of a trade sale to a competitor. And the second business, a company called DX, which we exited by way of an IPO on AIM. So I then did the statutory, well, minimum 2 years as CFO of a quoted company, and then left that 4 years ago. I've spent 3 years working with a fintech startup. We've now just got the license for that to operate as a new stock exchange in the UK, specialising in commercial real estate. And I left that just as the COVID crisis kicked in. So I started looking in March and found that the world for CFOs had gone somewhat quiet. But I'm very hoping that in the next couple of days we'll be announcing that where I'm moving to next. I think one of the things you learn about exits is that every single one is different. You cannot approach it on a formulaic basis, and you can learn all the technicalities, all the legal aspects, but ultimately it comes down to people and understanding people and their motivations, and also actually understanding that some of the stakeholders and players in an exit process do not always play rationally, and sometimes they have hidden agendas. So it's you need the people skills to try and tease those out, and because nothing ruins an exit process more quickly than skeletons jumping out of the cupboard at you. So I mean, that would be my thing. Make sure you don't just focus on the numbers and the process, but you're understanding the people and the motivations.
Thanks, Ian. And let's start then at the sort of beginning in relation to planning an exit. And this question's to you, Ian. When you start planning an exit strategy, when do you start it, and what is the FD's role in this?
Yeah, I mean, it varies from case to case. It depends on the exact circumstances, and it depends who your stakeholders are. If you're, as Steve was talking about, being CFO of a subsidiary that was sold, the exit process and the timetable is going to be controlled by the owner, and the management team we can come on to MBOs, but may have limited involvement in that. Alternatively, if it's a family company and they're talking about retirement, then that's going to be the key driver of the timetable. Or if you're in a private equity backed business, then you know that 3 to 5 year window is their ideal time for looking for an exit. So I think the FD's or CFO's role is to make sure they are close to all of the stakeholders and understanding where they're coming from, so that you get a good idea of when an exit is coming. And in terms of the early stages of planning and the FD's role, I think it largely comes down, I think, to good housekeeping, because the amount of work and effort in an exit process should not be underestimated. There will be huge, and rightly or wrongly, my experience is that everybody looks to the CFO as the font of all knowledge for everything, in that the CEO will clearly talk about strategy and vision, but if any documentation is required, they tend to go straight to the CFO. So, I think it's actually just good practice to keep your house in order and start thinking about what will be required in a data room. And actually, why not just keep that data room as a live repository for all of the documents that you want to hand, so that you can find them easily when you need to pull them up at short notice. And the other thing I think is key for the FD or CFO is to make sure that there is an active, an accurate model that is being used for budgeting, can be used for forecasting, that goes down to the right level of granularity. And you shouldn't need to be creating this from scratch. It should be the one that you can be using for your budget purposes, but you're rolling it out and just extending it a few years, because that's going to be key to any exit process. So having a model that has the right level of granularity, works, and can be flexible so that you can run different assumptions through it to show what that does to profits and cash flow, I think is key for the FD, just thinking about the exit from an early stage.
Thanks, Ian. And Steve, anything to add on that in terms of planning an exit strategy?
Well, I think Ian covered an awful lot there, Phil, but I would certainly pick up on the point that you can almost never start to plan too early. And I think with a lot of enterprises, when they are in the startup phase, it doesn't do any harm, even then, to start to have some kind of forward-looking view as to what the exit might or might not be, what form it would take. And to that end, I completely endorse what was just said about having a model that you can run different assumptions, different scenarios through. And in fact, often those models are necessary when businesses start out, frequently in connection with raising funding. So why not build a good fit for purpose model at that point in time? Keep it live, keep it up to date, keep testing it, because it really will serve you well. You don't want to be building a model from scratch in a hurry with all kind of headlights shining at you when you begin the exit planning process. Many businesses, I think, come to the point where they realize that actually they could maybe now do better with a new parent. Sometimes businesses come to recognize that the current owner's access to capital is insufficient to take the business on to the next level. And that might lead to either a partial or a full exit. Sometimes agents of change just begin to become apparent around the markets or the technology. And sometimes the response to those agents of change is to say, should we do something different in terms of the ownership of the business?
Thanks, Steve. And Ian, how do you determine who to sell to? And does your exit strategy sort of differ depending on who the potential buyers are?
So the answer to the last question is most definitely yes. There are different considerations depending on the type, the structure of the exit and what type of exit it is, and indeed whether management is going to be continuing. How do you decide what the exit process is? I mean, it's never going to be completely the CFO's decision. It's going to be a collective decision, but similarly, it's not just the asset owner's decision either. I mean, it can be, but if they want to get best value, they're always going to get best value by making sure that the management team is on side. So if you think of the various types of exit, I mean, even for a trade sale where they might want to conceivably part company with the senior leadership team, they're unlikely to get best value unless the senior leadership team is on board with the exit process. And that means that they've been, which is always an opportunity for management. I'd always advise management to get their incentivization sorted out very early in the exit process. So, is it going to be a trade sale? Could it be a private equity MBO, MBI, or is it a public IPO that people are thinking of as the exit process? And they're all very different. And in many cases, in order to get best value, advisors will commonly be saying, well, let's run a dual process, or sometimes even a three-way process, where they will pursue an auction of the business where both private equity and trade buyers are allowed to participate, and at the same time start thinking about an IPO. And only further down the road will they take a view on value as to where they think they can get the best return. Now that creates a lot of work, but fundamentally the information required for both routes is the same. It's just slightly sort of more of a balancing act in deciding how to go. But the management team as a whole will have an influence in making that decision, because unless you have the management team on side, the vendor or the asset owner is unlikely to get best value. So I think it's absolutely vital that management are involved, and the CFO is joined at the hip with the CEO, and they're communicating closely and working closely together.
Thanks, Ian. And Steve, what key things need to be in place to make the organisation an attractive proposition, and how is the FD involved in helping with these?
Well, I think good housekeeping was already mentioned by Ian a few moments ago. So I think the kind of things that one would need to give attention to are customer contracts performing correctly. If there have been acquisitions as part of a group, have they been properly integrated? Is the intellectual property properly protected? Management team alignment and incentivization, I really can't stress too much how important that observation is, and I think Ian's brought that to the fore in his last remarks. And then the whole idea of, is the business structured in a way which is going to facilitate a smooth change of control? Because as groups of companies evolve over time, they sometimes end up with a structure which really is not well positioned for many, if not all, of the parties who are likely to be interested in acquiring it.
Thanks, Steve. And Ian, how do you know when is the right time to start approaching potential buyers?
I think it's partly driven by the advisors. The thing I would stress, and it's almost going back upon what we've said before, is don't go too early. Don't go when you're not ready, and without wanting to sound like we're talking about the same thing over and over. You're coming back, both Steve and I were talking about the model. If you start pressing the process and someone starts asking you about your forecasts and what happens if this happens, or what happens if that happens, and you say, well, I need a week to go away and write a model, you're just losing all momentum. So you need to be ready to press the button, because actually things can accelerate really very quickly. As I say, no two deals are the same, but you could have the situation whereby just by announcing that or just market gossip getting out that the company might be on the blocks, somebody may come in with a killer blow saying, okay, I think your real value is X, but I'm going to offer X plus 10%, but I want exclusivity now. I don't want you to run the process straight. And some people will say, okay, that's a sufficiently attractive offer that we're going to go with that. So you need to be ready. You need to have your data room largely assembled. You need to have that model ready, because you never know when it's going to happen. And again, I can't emphasize enough the management need to be involved in the decisions and the discussions, because if there is a trade buyer, for instance, that management just have a fundamental issue with and don't want to work with, that needs to be communicated up front. And the other thing I would advise, certainly if and this is maybe slightly more controversial, if a private equity route is a possibility, a management buyout, then I think it's increasingly important that management do get independent advisors sooner rather than later, because they actually get themselves into a conflicted position as being both part of the buying party and the selling party, and they have obligations to both sides. So I think having an independent advisor who can help on managing the process, but also represent the management in discussions and negotiations is important. And I think it eases the process, and I think it also means the management tend to get a better deal out of it.
Thanks, Ian. And Steve, who is responsible for approaching potential buyers?
I think a number of people perhaps feel that they would be or should be responsible, but certainly in my experience, it's something that needs to be managed very carefully, such that you don't have a situation where there's any number of people who have taken it upon themselves to start holding conversations here and there. So it could be a nominated director, perhaps a non-executive director if the business has non-execs appointed. Could very well be an advisor, one of the corporate finance houses, possibly external accountants, and for certain transactions, of course, then the business may have given a mandate to an investment bank to assist. But I think from my experience, the one thing that matters above all else is that that part of the process is properly controlled.
Thanks, Steve. And Ian, Steve mentioned advisors. Obviously, there's lots of different advisors you can bring in to assist with the process. So, what advisors would you typically bring in, and sort of what criteria would you use to select them?
I mean, I think there's I mean, ultimately you have to have a corporate finance advisor who's going to structure the process, lead the process, probably approach the buyers, and I think I think there is a lot to be said for appointing that advisor who really understands the sector and actually may have very close relationships with many of the potential buyers already, but will certainly understand the key drivers of the business. And I think if possible, you want somebody doing that role who's independent to a certain extent. If you're a subsidiary of a big PLC, they are probably going to want to use their group corporate finance advisor, and management probably won't have a lot of say in that matter. But you want somebody who understands the independent role they have to play, and the different stakeholders will be obviously the shareholders and the management, and who is going to demonstrate that independence. And I think the other key area is the lawyers, actually. You can't underestimate the importance of getting the right legal team. The amount of documentation involved in an exit is only ever going to keep going up and up and up, and it gets increasingly complicated. And I think if any CFO goes into an exit process thinking that they are going to read every draft of every document, they're probably kidding themselves, because I just don't think it's possible. And I don't think there are any single lawyers who do that, because they have teams doing different aspects of the transaction. So what you really need is a close relationship with your lawyer that you really trust, because at the end of the day, I mean, I've seen it where private equity houses appoint lawyers, but it's wrong, because those lawyers their engagement letter is with the company. The bill is being paid for by the company, not by the private equity house. And you need to develop a strong relationship so that you are getting the communications, you are being involved in all the decisions, and most importantly, that you have a trusted contact at your lawyer who, when the latest draft of the document comes out, rather than you having to look through the track changes, is just going to spend half an hour with you on the telephone explaining what's changed since the last draft. Because one, you're not going to get the time to read every draft, and secondly, there'll always be subtle legal nuances that our simple accountants might not pick up on. So I think having that close relationship with a trusted lawyer is key.
Thanks, Ian. And Steve, what documentation do you need to prepare before approaching buyers, and who's responsible for preparing the documentation, and how involved is the FD?
I think it probably does depend largely on the size and the shape of the transaction that's being contemplated, but likely to require some kind of invitation to express an interest, which would then be coupled to a non-disclosure agreement. an information memorandum or some form of vendor due diligence report. We're back again to financial projections, models, pro forma accounts, and almost certainly recently audited financial statements for many transactions. So an awful lot of that will inevitably be served up in the direction of the FD or the CFO.
Thanks, Steve. And Ian, have you anything to sort of add on that, and more so into the relation to the next question, which, you know, how do you achieve better multiples?
Well, I think you achieve better multiples by creating the right positive story, and I think there are a number of elements to that. I think having a clear presentation on your strategic objectives is vital, because one, it convinces people, the management team, are proactive and that they know what they're doing. Secondly, if you can then show what has been achieved, that's great. And also, but you need to show also what is left on the table, because certainly if it's a potential private equity transaction, they want to know that there's future growth possibilities. So you need to be highlighting those. So yeah, we've done this, we've grown the business from here to here, but actually there's this much more to go on. And achieving better multiples, I think, is all about creating confidence. I mean, a lot of the multiples will be driven by cash flow, and again, we come back to model again, because there will be pressure on the CFO in the early stages of an exit process to create a set of projections, and the CFO needs to be absolutely confident that those projections are achievable. Because if you cave into the pressure, just put an extra bid on, just put an extra 10% on in year 4 and 3% on in year 2, and you start racing away and getting this hockey stick that you in your heart know that is not achievable, you're just storing trouble up for the future, because you're going to be the person that has to deliver on this. And secondly, in terms of destroying value in an exit process, nothing destroys value quicker than saying, oh, we're now running behind plan on the current year. That, the multiple will start tumbling. So I would almost look at the other. You don't want to undersell the business, but actually nothing increases multiple higher and say, we said we were going to do 10 million this year, we're halfway through. Actually, we think we're going to do 11. That's what adds to the multiple. Whereas, saying we're going to do 10 and saying actually we think it's going to be 8 is where it destroys value very, very quickly. So if you can eke out good news during the process, that I think does really help, I say, as well as highlighting the strategic objectives going forward.
Thanks, Ian. And Steve, anything to add on that, on how you can achieve better multiples?
Well, I think it is to a degree dependent upon making a critical assessment of the types of buyers and the jurisdiction that is going to place the highest value on the opportunity that's being offered. So capital markets and exits involving financial buyers may very well, to begin with, suggest higher multiples, but probably also come with greater execution risk attaching to them. I think the other thing that we have alluded to, but let's mention it again, you've just got to turn over all the stones under which a problem might be hiding, because if that problem emerges at an inopportune time, as Ian has just said, everything will quickly start to go in the wrong direction in terms of valuation and multiples.
Yeah, so don't cave into any pressure to deliberately put things back under stones either, because then you will look like an idiot when it comes out.
Thanks, Ian and Steve. So Steve, question to you. when doing presentations or preparing for presentations, what information do you need to prepare? What questions could generally come up, and what's the FD's role in preparing this information and answering those questions?
Well, I think these kind of presentations generally involve talking to a focused slide deck, which tells the business's story in an engaging fashion. Talks about the products, talks about the markets, the technology, the people, and of course, the numbers. Many of the questions that will be asked, I think, are reasonably predictable based upon the content of the presentation slides and the key messages and themes, but there's always going to be something that's going to look and feel like a blindside move coming from somewhere within the audience, and you need to be ready for that. I suppose it's the old adage, you just rehearse and rehearse and rehearse, because there will be questions that take you a little bit by surprise. What is the FD's role in preparing this? Well, again, really quite considerable, because when it comes to matters of detailed fact, and of course detailed fact has got to be at the heart of these presentations, it seems inevitably most eyes turn in the direction of the CFO.
Thanks, Stephen. Ian, anything to add on that?
No, I mean, first of all, I think it can be quite an enjoyable part of the process, because if you know your company and you're excited about the prospects for it, then it's quite relaxing and quite fun talking about it. And again, I can't, echoing Steve, that the CFO is going to be hugely involved, and I guess it depends on the advisors. Sometimes the advisors like to lead the drafting of the presentation. I've also done it where I've led the drafting as CFO, because ultimately I knew the business better than the advisors. But it's working closely with them, so I wouldn't complete it and then show it to them and say, what do you think? I would have discussions early on as to the structure of it, so that you're delivering something that they expect.
And Ian, what other things can happen in the negotiation, and how involved is the FD in that? I
think it comes back to what we've been saying all along, Steve and I, is no nasty surprises. And I see the CFO in being key on that, because even if you're aware of something that hasn't come out yet, you need to be discussing that on your side with the CFO, with the CEO and with the advisors, because you just do not want to give a buyer, especially once you're into exclusivity, you do not want to give the buyer any hooks upon which they can hang price chips, because most buyers, or a lot of buyers, will go in, they'll be offering a number and then thinking that during the due diligence or execution process, they'll be chipping amounts off that. And certainly if your numbers are coming in under forecast, that's a key one. Obviously losing customers, etc. And I mean, I've even been in a process where, to get exclusivity, a buyer put an extra 10% on the table. They got the exclusivity, they found some issue with a customer that they weren't particularly happy about, and managed to chip a little bit off the price. And then the day before completion, I got a message saying they'd gone back to their original offer. And I remember ringing the CEO and saying, what have you found in due diligence that's led you to a price chip? And he said, nothing. I just want to get back to my first offer, not the price I gave you for exclusivity. And you've got to bear that in mind, and you need to work with the management team and the stakeholders to know what your response is going to be to that. So it's a collective response. And one thing I'd also stress, that during the negotiation process, it is hugely distracting. And one of the things we haven't covered actually is who in the business knows that this process is going on. It actually is quite difficult to do it secretly. I think if you can be more open with your senior management, I think that's a positive step. but also it is hugely distracting and time consuming, particularly for the CEO and the CFO. So if you are not careful, you can damage your own business because you're not spending enough time on it. And there is always the chance that the exit process does not complete because you can't get the price that the stakeholders wanted, or some COVID occurs, so that, loads of transactions being pulled. And the last thing you want is to damage your underlying business because you've been too busy working on the exit. So I think when you go into that process, have a look at your team. Is it strong enough? Do you need to get some help for a while? Because you just don't know what's going to happen in that process. And the last thing you want is to come out with a weaker company than you went in with.
Thanks, Ian. And of course, you can use a company like FD Recruit to give you some.
Oh yeah, I missed that. Sorry, I missed that. It was in my script.
Over to you, Steve. Can you just discuss with me the different ways you can structure a deal that is to the benefit of the seller?
Of course, there are any number of different flavours of transaction that can and do evolve. But from the point of view of broad categories, generally an exit is going to be either the sale of the shares in a business, or it could be the sale of the business and assets as distinct from selling the shares. And both have the potential to offer advantages, and both have the potential for being disadvantageous to both parties. Other things that frequently become part of the process are deferred consideration structures, earn-out structures, which again have upside and downside potential. And many of those structures will inevitably lead to questions in terms of, well, what would be the financial quantification of a different set of assumptions applied to one or more of the variable components of the deal that's beginning to emerge. And then again, you're back to the FD or the CFO being able to readily and accurately quantify those impacts, and that means you have to have the tools and the information available. So again, we're talking about having reliable modelling tools and sensible and reliable inputs to the assumptions that those tools run off.
Thanks, Stephen. Ian, anything to add on that, on how you can structure deals to the benefit of the seller?
Yeah, it depends partly on what the exit mechanism is, and it also depends on whether you, as the management team, think that you'll be staying on under the new structure or whether you're leaving. So, I mean, things that you can do, you can certainly do a sweep of surplus cash to maximise value, but you can do that obviously by stretching your creditors and trying to reduce your debtor days. But if you're doing an MBO, what you don't want to do is go into the new structure and suddenly find out your working capital's short, and you actually shot yourself in the foot. So that's something to be aware of, and also understanding how a buyer is valuing the business. So certainly one exit that I was involved in, we got into the exclusivity phase. And I spoke to the buyer very carefully as to how he'd arrived at his valuation, and it was a profit multiple and a cash flow basis. So it was all on profits and cash. So I just looked at him and I said, "There's nothing here. There's no relation to asset value. No, none at all. Nothing to asset value." I said, "Good, because we own a piece of land that we bought for development purposes. That clearly isn't included in your valuation, and therefore it's not part of the deal. And we just took that asset out of the deal into a separate company and sold that at a later date. So just to increase the value. And there's things that you can look at on that. And one thing I just wanted to add is when you get down to the exclusivity stage, management needs to be, this is management as a whole, not just the CFO, you need to be, not arrogant, but forthright in just determining management's position. Now, you may not be able to determine who the buyer is, or whether it's an MBO or a trade sale, but you need upfront. I've just seen it go wrong for management teams too many times, and I specifically remember two guys who owned a business and were selling it to a trade buyer, and I wasn't directly involved, but I was sort of advising them informally, and I said, look, make sure you get your terms agreed early on. And they went, yeah. And then it went through the sale process, and then they started due diligence. I said, have you got your terms agreed? And they went, no, but the buyer says they're doing it. And then they got into the legal documentation. I said, have you got your terms agreed? And they didn't. And it got to the final day, and their salaries going forward were nowhere near nothing like what they expected. And this is well, you just need to address this sort of thing early on in the process. And anybody sensible will try and do that, because actually they want management on side. But but you're going to have to be fairly firm as a management team at the early stage of the process to just get these things agreed so that everyone knows where you stand.
Thanks, Ian. And Steve, we've talked about exclusivity, so presuming as you've gone through the process, there's someone who you're granted exclusivity to, and then you enter the due diligence. Just talk me through the due diligence, the vendor due diligence, what sort of things come up, and how involved is the FD in that?
In my experience, the FD is absolutely central to that process. I have spent hours and hours in interviews with potential buyers, having all kinds of questions fired at me, and it's a process that, as Ian had alluded to, on the one hand can be quite enjoyable, but it's enjoyable if you've done all the right preparatory steps first, because it truly does challenge your ability to articulate where the business has come from, where it's capable of going to, and to be able to back that up with properly reasoned evidential support. So I think that whole due diligence exercise, it takes many forms. A lot of it is done through data room processes now, online data rooms as opposed to paper data rooms. And a lot of it involves sitting down and just answering questions. And of course, those interviews do need to be controlled in a way, because they do consume a huge amount of time. So don't put yourself in a position where you're prepared to spend endless hours answering endless questions. There needs to be some sort of focus and some sort of framework put around it. But vendor due diligence, I think, has definitely become more prevalent. And I think the advantage of the vendor due diligence is that it genuinely brings you to the preparatory work that we've spoken about at some length during this discussion at the right time in the process.
Thanks, Steve. And on the run up to the sort of completion day, what other things can crop up?
Sorry, were you asking?
Steve, yeah, sorry. Just on the run up to completion date, is there anything else that can crop up?
Well, I think there's usually quite a menu of things that need to be worked through. And so things that come to mind, there will probably be various conditions precedent that are written into the agreements. They've all got to be checked off and ticked off. you may very well find that you have to agree some kind of funds flow plan, particularly if debt is being retired as part of the transaction, to make sure that money is moving or will move through all of the right accounts in the right order. It may very well be that you have to organise some forward foreign currency sales, particularly if the purchase consideration is being delivered in a currency which is different to the one that the stakeholder operates within. A lot of attention probably at this point now needs to start to focus towards employee briefings and consultations. You may have to have a physical inventory taking process. Bank mandates will probably have to be altered. And probably also a number of board meetings will have to be prepared and agreed prior to them being executed concurrent with the completion. So I think there's a lot of mechanics that need to be attended to.
Thanks, Steve. And Ian, anything to add on that, on the sort of things that crop up?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, Steve's perfectly correct. The FD tends to be the internal project manager for the entire due diligence process and expected to know all the answers or where to find them. But I just think in that run up to completion, there is so much happening. As well as the due diligence process, you've also got the documentation moving, and it's not just the sale and purchase agreement. You know, for instance, if it is a management buyout, you're dealing with a PE house which is going to be hugely experienced in structuring these transactions. And as I said up front, management need to have their own advice. You just need to be careful because the devil is in the detail, and you'll end up, you know, inevitably there'll be some sort of shareholders agreement which governs how the business is run going forward. And it is quite right that the private equity house has certain controls and certain vetoes, and that's normal and to be expected. But they've got to be set at the right level. So I think it is reasonable to have a limit on CapEx where no project over X can be undertaken by the company without sign-off from the private equity house. But you don't want X to be too small a number. You know, it's got to be, you can't have it slowing down the operation of the company. Similarly, in terms of employing senior management, of course, there's going to be a right for them to have a say, but it needs to be at a level that works for the company. And also with reporting, with the facilities agreement with the banks that Steve mentioned, with the shareholders agreement, there's going to be an obligation going forward for the company to be providing information to the debt and equity stakeholders. But you need to make sure that the information that's requested and that you have committed to provide is relevant. You know, don't commit to providing a whole raft of stuff that actually, you know, is just going to be a pain in the backside to produce, and you don't think is going to add any value to anybody. So just commit to what is relevant, and just be careful, because that devil is in the detail, and you don't want to suddenly sort of wake up with your new life in a new company and you open the shareholders agreement and think, we've got to do what? It's just not a healthy way to start.
Thanks, Ian. And Steve, just talk me through then what happens on the day of completion.
Well, in my experience, a lot of documents get circulated and signed. Money starts to move, and that's normally all being orchestrated by the lawyers acting for both parties. And there may be a press release that needs to go out. And after that, perhaps everybody gets a chance to draw breath for 5 minutes.
Thanks.
I mean, in my experience, it can either be an anticlimax, and actually the lawyers are so well prepared, it just, you know, the documentation signing ceremony runs like clockwork. But I think I have completed very few deals between the hours of 9 AM and 5 PM. It tends to be quite a lot of long, boring evenings where, you know, the lawyers are suddenly spotting a couple of minor sort of documentation issues that they're trying to sort out. They actually may not need your input on, but you can't go anywhere because you're going to be sitting there signing the document. So I think, you know, try and get as much sleep as you can in the run-up to completion, because it can be a long drawn out event.
And what are the post-sale considerations, Ian?
I think it's the most important, or one of the most important ones, is exactly what Steve touched on, which is employee communication. You know, for any business, doesn't matter what sector you're in, employees are going to be your most important asset, and treating them with the respect that they deserve and communicating with them clearly and on a timely basis is absolutely key. And certainly when I moved from being, I guess, an investor to being CFO of a company, that you realise when you buy something, you know, the day you sign that document, you're maybe 5% of the way to generating any value from it. It's all about communication and getting people on board. And again, I come back to you getting the basics in place early as to what needs to be done, but also you want to hit those targets that you set. So if you stayed with the business and you said, right, in the first quarter following completion, our sales are going to be X and our profits are going to be Y. If you're missing those in the first quarter, that is painful in terms of the additional interrogation you're going to get, in terms of the confidence in management ability that gets destroyed. I mean, clearly, if there's a completely sort of independent factor like COVID or a tidal wave or something, that's understandable. But you know, on a sort of normal business basis, you do not want to miss those early forecasts. Again, it comes back to having realistic projections.
Thanks, Ian. Just another sort of 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll start to go to take questions on from the viewers. Just a reminder, if anyone wants to put a question to either of the panelists, if you use the chat box, which is located at the bottom of your screen. So Steve, question to you. I mean, it's almost summarising everything we've discussed. You know, what are the benefits of having an FD in place then to help with this exit planning and process?
Yeah, I think you're right. It is in a way summarising what we've been talking about for the last hour or so. I think a good FD will be able to connect all the separately moving parts of the overall objective of achieving the best valuation for the lowest execution risk. And speaking from my own experience, it's great fun. It's extremely tiring. It's very demanding, but it is fun. It's why I have, throughout my career, in a way been drawn to those situations. I don't think I ever really wanted to be the FD of a business that just went from month to month to month to month. I felt like I wanted to be doing something that was going to contribute to the realization of a business owner or a collection of stakeholders' ambitions and dreams. And as you move through these kinds of transactions, you build the experience, you build the confidence, and you learn the hard lessons. But I certainly think that having some of that experience available when you embark upon one of these processes is really rather essential.
Thanks, Stephen. Question to you, Ian. If there's any FDs out there that are about to embark on the first exit process, obviously you know, knowing what you know now, what advice, what would you have to an FD who's about to go through an exit process?
I would say make sure you understand the process, get close, really focus on building efficient and trusted relationships with the key advisors, because you know, they can hold your hand through the process, and make sure you stay absolutely joined at the hip with your CEO. And you know, I guess the final one, which I sort of noted down, was again, I've said it before, make sure you have a strong model and realistic projections. Don't get hoodwinked into inflating value artificially by putting some unsupportable, unjustifiable projections out there.
Thanks, Ian. Last question before we take on audience questions to you, Steve. What advice would you have to a business owner who is looking at doing an exit?
I think I would summarize that as saying that when you are sure you want to exit, then fully commit both the time and the resources. And if the resources aren't readily available in-house, then please think hard about where you can go to get them.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, we'll go into the questions that the viewers have put into the chat box. So anyone that does want to add any questions into that, the chat box at the bottom. So either to Steve and Ian, you can pop your hand up if you fancy answering this one. You mentioned the importance of the correct incentivization. What does a good incentivization model look like?
Sorry, I think it comes back to what the route's going to be. You know, is it going to be a trade sale? And if it is, are management expected to continue? Is it going to be an IPO? Is it going to be a management buyout? You know, ultimately, you're not trying to be greedy. You just need to know where you stand. And if a trade buyer says, "Look, I really, really want this business, but one of my cost efficiencies, I don't need a CEO and I don't need a CFO," then I think it's far better for everybody if he says that up front. And that actually he says, "Look, but I want you to be a key part of this transaction. I'm going to treat you fairly, and these are going to be your terms." On a management buyout, you will get independent advisors who can work with the management team and then work with them in selecting the appropriate private equity house, and that will drive the management terms because they will each have different views on what they can afford to give management in terms of an equity stake. But I just think it's good to try and get these things on the table earlier rather than later, because there are some people out there, if you don't get this sorted early on, will take the opportunity to try and leg people over at the end of the process.
Thanks, Ian. Yep, Steve.
Yes, I think it's such a demanding process, particularly if it's a complicated deal or a capital markets deal, that you really do need the key players to not be wasting their energy thinking about whether or not they are being treated fairly. That is energy you just cannot afford to waste.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. What's the most common signs of an exit process losing momentum? Who wants that one?
I'm trying to think what the answer is. I think it's. I mean, the advisors should be responsible ultimately for driving the momentum, and they should be very clear. Certainly, if it's an auction process, in setting out the times and the deadlines. So first offers by this date, second offers by this date, and they will also be pretty good actually at cracking the whip during the due diligence process. They will always want you as CFO to move faster than perhaps it's physically possible to move. It all comes down to communication. If a potential buyer suddenly starts taking a lot of time to come back with any answers, I think that's a sign that it's beginning to drift.
I think the other sign is when members of the stakeholder group start to become misaligned, and that can happen.
One thing I didn't add earlier on, what I think is important, is if you're the owner of the business, you need to know why you're selling and what it is that you're trying to achieve. And therefore, I think at the outset, you should almost have a red line and know. It's very easy to get drawn into the process. We've spent all this money, we've spent all this, invested all this time. But there are certain things that might happen. Price is the obvious one, where you're not meeting your aspirations. So I think the owners of the business need to have in their mind what it is they're trying to achieve and when it is that they're going to walk away and just say, no, actually, we're not selling. And I think it's useful to try and have that discussion up front so that you're not wasting people's time.
Thanks, Ian. Moving on to one of the other questions. Is there a baseline rule of thumb to value a company, i.e. profit multiplier, combination of cash, P&L and balance sheet? Who wants that one? Steve?
Well, I think all of those are relevant, but in my experience, and we've said it before, we'll say it again, you need to have the ability with a properly integrated model to value on a number of different bases. It seems to me that eventually somebody wants to look at future cash flows and future profits. And unless you've got a model that is properly prepared and integrates all of those things, that becomes very difficult.
And I think, just adding on to that, I mean, clearly if it's a trade buyer, as well as the profits of the target, they will be targeting certain synergies or cost saving opportunities. And it is not unreasonable for the seller of the business to be thinking, well, we should be getting a part of that upside. You know, we are facilitating, by selling to you, we are facilitating you saving £5 million a year, where you're saying you're going to value us on 8 times EBITDA. So if there's another 8 times 5 million that's just been on the table, so we'd like part of that, please. That can become part of the negotiating process as well.
Great, thank you. I mean, that pretty much brings us up to time. There's a couple of questions that we've not managed to answer. I think one of them was to you, Ian, on the sort of land bit that you discussed earlier. So if anyone does want to reach out to either of you, is LinkedIn the best way, and you're happy to take any sort of any conversations offline as well?
Very happy to do that.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Because there's 1 or 2 questions coming there that people might want to sign in and contact you separately. So a massive thank you to everybody who's tuned in and listened. A big thank you, obviously, to Steve and Ian for giving us your expertise and insights there. And yeah, thanks to everyone. And I'd like to formally bring the session to a close.
All right. Thank you. You're right.